Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. In 2016, the great British music journalist and broadcaster David Hepworth published a book called Never a Dull Moment, 1971, the year that rock exploded. In it, he details all the important developments in popular music of that year, particularly in rock, and makes the argument as to why 1971 is the greatest year ever in music. That book seemed to kickstart a trend in music media curation, where, in various outlets and platforms, websites, blogs, social media postings, YouTube channels, all of a sudden it became hip to glorify the year 1971 as, well, the greatest year ever in music. This came to a peak in 2021 when Apple Plus streamed an ambitious 8-part documentary series called 1971, the Year That Music Changed Everything. As we near the end of our second golden age of rock series and finally make a stop in that hallowed year, we ask ourselves, is 1971 really the greatest year ever for music? Well, for sure, several of the greatest artists and bands of this era released arguably their greatest albums. Led Zeppelin, The Who, Joni Mitchell, Carole King, Marvin Gaye, Sly and the Family Stone, Funkadelic, Alice Cooper, T-Rex, The Temptations, Rod Stewart, and the Allman Brothers Band. Other artists and bands released albums that are a little more arguably their greatest albums, but definitely among their very best. Black Sabbath, Santana, The Doors, Isaac Hayes, David Bowie, Can, Nick Drake, and the two chief Beatles, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And no, the Rolling Stones' Sticky Fingers, while a 5-star classic and one of the greatest albums ever, and an album we will discuss in detail in this episode, is most definitely not the Stones' greatest album. That would be the record the Stones would release the following year, and that will be the subject of another discussion and another episode. In the meantime, sit back, light up a joint or press on your vape, and gaze into that lava lamp while we take you on a ride through the delectable year in rock, soul, and R&B that was 1971, nearing the end of rock's second golden age, and we'll decide whether or not this is the best year ever. Welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
Hey, Arturo, what time is it?
Here in Korea, it's 12 noon.
Oh, okay, but what time is it really?
I don't know. What time is it, Chris?
It's time to enter the parallel universe, baby.
Oh, okay. That's
yeah,
what you're
that's the time, man. What's the time? Time to get ill over in the parallel universe. We've ripped the space-time continuum. We're over in the grand lands where rock and roll is fertile in the fields and is still a predominantly awesome musical cultural force and has not gone the way of jazz and is not niche and is revered by all the kiddies in all the stores. There's such a thing as a record store, a real record store, like a Tower Records in the parallel universe. That's a kind of a weird, fancy way of saying that the parallel universe is the segment where Arturo and I discuss new and newish records by artists we think that you ought to check out and that we think in a parallel universe would be valued as superstars. And in Arturo's case, you're talking about a fairly high profile guy, but in a parallel universe, he would be enormous now, wouldn't he?
Yes, Kamasi Washington, the jazz saxophonist from Los Angeles. Yeah, I mean he plays. He's a kind of big name. But yeah, in our parallel universe, he'd be filling up arenas. For over a decade, Kamasi Washington, has managed to make jazz hip again. For over a decade, with his expansive orchestral jazz sound that evokes the spiritual power of latter period John Coltrane, 1970s blaxploitation film soundtracks, and the splendor of gospel. His critical and somewhat commercial breakout was twofold. In 2015, Washington and his band guest starred on several tracks on hip hop great Kendrick Lamar's classic album, To Pimp a Butterfly. And Washington himself released his fifth album, a triple album at that same year, aptly named The Epic. 3 years later, he followed that up with Heaven and Earth, a more modest double album that earned rave reviews in music media, including Mojo Magazine naming it the best album of 2018. After a bit of a hiatus, Washington is back with, you guessed it, another double album. This one's called Fearless Movement, and it's a stunning record, his best album yet. Why? Two reasons. First, on this record, he has stripped away all the gospel choir vocals that he usually slathered all over his music. And the result is that this decision has given his music more air and space to breathe. It also distracts the listener less and allows us to really focus on the wonderful instrumentation and the band's supple rhythm section. Second, it's stylistically his most eclectic record, with forays into R&B, soul, blues, funk, and hip hop scattered throughout the album, making it also his most adventurous and exciting album. Disc one starts, honestly enough, with Lesanu, a straightforward traditional jazz jam, albeit a kick-ass rocking jam. Computer Love is a smoldering, jazzy soul track with its clever lyrics satirizing the dehumanizing aspects of online dating. The Visionary is a short instrumental segue that leads into Get Lit, a scintillating funk track featuring George Clinton and the rapper D Smoke, while Dream State ends disc one with a lovely slice of spiritual spacey jazz featuring Andre 3000 of Outkast on flutes. Disc two slow burns its way into your ear with the delectable slow jam R&B of Together. Road to Self, and then OK in parentheses, is a groovy mid-tempo jam with while Interstellar Peace, in parentheses, The Last Stance, floats along with a gorgeous haunting piano motif by Brandon Coleman and Washington's lush beatific saxophone riffs. Lines in the Sand is the most richly melodic track on the whole album, with some exquisite saxophone soloing by Washington. The whole thing ends with Prologue, a track that I posted on our Facebook community page a while back. And it's a heavily percussive jam with trumpet, alto saxophone, and tenor saxophone exchanging in a back and forth of scathing solos and punctuated by all three horns uniting in the most beautiful motif on the album. I mean, Beyonce's Cowboy Carter may be objectively the best album of the year, but this is the album of 2024 that I keep coming back to. Chris?
Yeah, good stuff. And here's a fun fact: "Computer Love" is a cover of
Oh,
an old Zapp song from 1986. Now, Zapp,
wow.
folks might know, Roger Troutman headed Zapp, and their whole shtick was vocoder vocals and kind of sort of space cowboy kind of shit, like space
Yeah,
disco.
right.
And Computer Love in its original form is one of these electronic, buzzy, vocalized, kind of corny ass slow jam type of
Yeah.
things. And
That is not what this version is. And
yeah, and so for Kamasi Washington to take Computer Love and stretch it out into this sort of like epic, soulful, almost ballady
yeah,
kind of jazz workout is
yeah,
kind of clever, because
yeah,
the original is cheesy. And so
right.
for him to take a cheesy vocalized 80s funk track and to do that to him, it kind of shows where he's at. The other impressive thing about this record is it's clearly meant as sort of a little bit of a tribute or a little bit of a kaleidoscopic revisitation of American freak flag black music.
Mm,
I don't think it's a coincidence that both George Clinton and Andre 3000
right.
guest on the
Yeah.
record because
Right.
in a lot of ways, Kamasi Washington is their spiritual cousin.
Yeah.
He does with jazz, what those guys did respectively with funk and with hip hop.
Right.
And so for him to put them on there is a pretty neat trick. So yeah, no, I'm a big fan of the record as well. I think it's one of the better records I'll hear all year. It is long. It is 86 minutes, which would not have fit on a CD
No,
had this
that's
been.
why it's a double album.
Yeah, it's a legitimately double album. Like lots of old double albums like Blonde on Blonde, etc., can fit on one disc. This is
Yeah.
truly a double album because it is larger and one disc cannot contain Fearless Movement. So very, very good stuff. Now, I'm doing something here in this segment I didn't envision when we started planning it out a couple weeks back. Initially, my thought was to recommend the rapper Vince Staples' brilliant little 2018 album FM, while at the same time lamenting how badly he's fallen off since then. But then Vincent went and released an actually pretty good album in late May called Dark Times. The relative strength of the new album is one of the biggest surprises of 2024 so far. And so, therefore, yes, I'm actually recommending that you check it out in its 3.5 star to 4 star glory, somewhere in there. But first, I do want to talk about why we care about Vince Staples in the first place. Staples, who grew up in Compton and North Long Beach near Los Angeles, California, first became a known commodity in hip hop through an association with members of the hip hop collective Odd Future and especially fellow rapper Earl Sweatshirt. He dropped a few compelling guest verses here and there, but gave no indication he was capable of brilliance in his first couple of years. But then came the release in 2018 of FM with an exclamation point, FM. And lo and behold, we were in the presence of a budding young star. His voice had a flair and an edge, and his producers served up some genuinely avant-garde trap beats. I mean, seriously, the beat to Fun with its dripping water evoking drum work is one of the best beats I've ever heard. And of course, I've heard a lot of beats in my life and in my adulthood. FM is foremost a study in economy, coming in at a stunningly efficient 11 tracks in 22 minutes and 20 seconds. There's an energy and a vibrancy throughout that makes it seem twice as long as Staples raps in a relatively high register that makes him seem urgent and dangerous and the most seismic thing going. There's also a structure to the songs that gives them a genuine pop and crackle. These songs on FM, they all have great hooks. Wow. FM should have marked the arrival of a new all-encompassing superstar to spring into the hip-hop mainstream. Yet that was not to be, as Staples failed to maintain the energy and edginess he had just established. Rather, he went the way of the LA rap mainstream. And on 2022's Ramona Park Broke My Heart, he went boringly and inexcusably autobiographical.
And he
Now,
broke our hearts. That album
yeah,
fucking sucks.
yeah, because maybe he grew up in gangland, but he didn't have to be so damn cliche about it. He also didn't have to sound like Drake.
Yeah,
Arturo
I know.
named Ramona Park Broke My Heart as his worst album of 2022 on this podcast about a year and a half ago,
Yeah.
and I've since come to agree with him. It's a pretty terrible record.
And the one
So
before that is really bad too. The self-titled Vince
self-titled record,
Staples. That from
yeah,
2021. It's the same shit. Those two records are interchangeable.
yeah. So I had pretty much given up on Vince Staples and was going to go all parallel vault up in this bitch and just solely focus on FM. And then Dark Times dropped. Remember, the name of the album is Dark Times. And whoa, Vince and his producers are back to sounding like they actually mean it and like they're actually trying. The beats are approaching the avant-garde once again. Check out especially the minimalist clap beat and organ beat work on New Orleans to LA crime drama tale Etouffee. There's also the twinkling piano notes and reverby trap boom of Government Cheese, on which Staples laments being the one guy to make it out of the neighborhood. And Vince is also back to being the efficiency guy, getting in, dominating, and getting out in 13 songs in 35 minutes with no fluff in sight. And Dark Times now is still nowhere near as good as FM. Very few albums in the hip hop genre are really, but at least he's shaking whatever triggered his hibernation in plain sight routine that led to some genuinely crappy records. The slump, I would say, is over. May Dark Times only be the beginning. Arturo, what say you about Vince Staples?
Yeah, I love FM. FM was my album of the year in 2018. It was my number one album of the year. It's everything you say it is. It's on my list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. And the next two records were so bad. It's just I think Vince Staples is a great rapper and a really underrated lyricist, and he's just not rapping on these records. He just mumble rap. He's not even rapping.
He raps on this one.
He's doing Drake bullshit.
Yeah.
It's just mumblecore bullshit. The beats are boring. They're meandering. They're plodding. They don't go anywhere. And I had not heard Dark Times because my heart was so broken by these two records that he's on my shit list. Maybe I will give it a shot later on.
Yeah, I think you'll be reassured.
He needs to get
surprised.
back to rapping, dude.
I was surprised. He sort of does get back to there. There is a little bit of that mumbly stuff going on, a little bit of the raspy stuff still, but he's really getting back to it, and it's probably his most upbeat stuff since FM. And I don't know. It's just an interesting record, and certainly back to the avant-garde. I mean, we're talking like minimalist trap to the nth here. So really engaging, interesting stuff. Again, not as good as FM. He probably will never get to that ballpark again. That was lightning in a bottle, and an astonishingly great use of 22 minutes, if there ever was one.
Right.
Like seriously, I mean, I was shocked to rediscover how short that album was. I mean, I don't remember it being that short because it's so engaging and so awesome. But here we go. Vince is back in the yard for everybody to behold what used to be his greatness and may be his greatness once again moving forward. Who knows? Chris here again. Arturo and I have differing feelings about the subscription streaming service Spotify. While he likes to rail against the algorithmic component, I like the ability to find and then manage a personal catalog of music. The program is especially great for assembling playlists. Well, guess what? We've assembled a playlist to accompany this episode. The playlist features a healthy mix of all the music we describe and analyze during the episode. Think of it as a soundtrack to your curmudgeonly life. Find the link in this episode's description. And also become a member of our curmudgeonly community on Facebook if you haven't done so already. Let's now return to our regularly scheduled programming. 1971. This is a year that is so dense, we just didn't have room to talk about three albums that I consider personal favorites of mine, which are Al Green Gets Next to You, Pink Floyd's Metal, and Savoy Brown's Street Corner Talking. Couldn't find room for any of those three records. And for those of you who know those records and are like, wow, that says something. Yeah, it does. 71 is pretty special, isn't it, Arturo?
It is. Like I said, we'll get back to this at the very end of this episode, and I guess I'll reiterate it. But really, I refuse to call this the greatest year ever because there's so many other years that are phenomenal, and I think just as good. And this second golden age of rock that we're talking about, every single year is amazing. Every single year from 1965 to 72 is amazing. So there really isn't like this year is better than that year. It's tribalism, and I refuse to get into that.
Okay.
You know?
Okay. I guess we can refuse to get into that, although for what it's worth,
Let's glorify each year on its own.
Yes, for what it's worth, 74 is pretty strong.
Underrated.
Tunes. It is very underrated, but yeah, you're right. I mean, it comes down. It gets kind of silly. It's kind of like the debate as to which of the Beatles, like 5 perfect records, is the most perfect.
Right.
Exactly. It's one of those debates, and so hey, at least it fills up airtime.
But we are talking about why do so many people, why has so much music media gone on with the books and the streaming documentaries and the YouTube channels going on about 1971. There is a reason, and we're going to get into that in this episode. And we're going to start, Chris, you're going to tell us about, okay, in rock music, there are 5 British bands that sit on top of the Pantheon. It's the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd. The Beatles were done by this point. 3 of those bands put out arguably their best records this year. Chris?
Yeah, a hell of a year. Here's a good indicator of just how loaded 1971 was as a year for great seminal and classic albums. In the most recent version of Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time exercise, 2 out of the top 3 albums that topped that poll came from 1971. Right. And we are not starting this episode with either of those records.
Although we will talk about them.
Yes, we are going to talk about them. Let's just put it this way. The intelligentsia can adore Marvin Gaye and Joni Mitchell all they want. And we are going to cover them, we promise. But the rest of us here, regular folks out here on the street, and we're men of the people, we start our 1971 diet with Led fucking Zeppelin, the Rolling fucking Stones, and the fucking Who.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk now first about Led Zeppelin 4. When I was 15 years old, my mother gave me a CD player boombox for Christmas. It was probably the most important gift I've ever received in my life. I was a burgeoning little geek iconoclast, and I needed a real rock and roll collection, damn it. Well, here was my starting point. My initial shopping trip for CDs with my own money produced 3 results: Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, the Beatles' Abbey Road, and Led Zeppelin 4. That's how far back I go with this album. Now, I also like to think that the stoners, the geeks, and the jocks from Richard Linklater's brilliant little film Dazed and Confused all got started as little rock and rollers several years before their 1976 setting to Led Zeppelin 4 as well. It really is a standard issue formative experience, and as long as there are bored white kids stuck in suburbia and rural America and left to drink beer and smoke pot on Friday nights, Zoso, as a lot of us affectionately refer to Led Zeppelin 4 in honor of the strange set of symbols that appear on its record jacket, will live on in perpetuity. Now, what is it that makes this album so great? Well, it's the culmination of all of the influences, sounds, and styles that the band teased across its first 3 albums, all great in their own right. We get amped up heavier than hell blues on opening songs Black Dog and Rock and Roll, both undying staples of classic rock radio. There's both the lilting acoustic fantasy play of the Battle of Evermore and the mystical boogie-woogie bop of Misty Mountain Hop, which proved that the odd Gollum reference in the final verse of Ramble On from Led Zeppelin 2 was not an accident. Boy, did these guys dig J.R.R. Tolkien.
Robert Plant for sure did.
Yes. There is the joyous jamminess of 4 Sticks and album closer When the Levee Breaks. There's the folksy heartbreak of Going to California. Additionally, there's a masterful sequencing of the songs that keeps everything vibrant and never-endingly predictable. Heck, I felt waves of excitement even this week as Going to California lulled me into the boom, boom, boom of When the Levee Breaks. This is one of the best, most consistent and consistently energetic song-to-song assemblies in the rock canon, just about perfect in that regard. And then there is Stairway to Heaven, which may be rock's ultimate masterpiece, an 8-minute opus in which everything in the universe seems to happen and build as it unfolds. It possesses one of the prettiest opening salvos, mixing John Paul Jones' pipe organ with Jimmy Page's artful acoustic strumming. It contains Robert Plant's most achingly gorgeous intro yelp, the one about the lady who knows that all that glitters is gold. So wow, we have ourselves a protagonist. Cool. It swells continually as we get more fantastical imagery. Her spirit is crying for leaving even although I swear Plant is actually saying, and my spirit is crying for Cleveland.
You know what? I had the same thing and at the crescendo. And as we wind on down the road, I always thought it was, and there's a wino down the road.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's those misleading earworms. Damn it, Stairway to Heaven is full of them. Or I mean, at least I wish he was saying Spirit is crying for Cleveland because that would just be cool. Now, this all leads to the second half of the middle part and the end, where the volume cranks, and in arguably rock's greatest riff. You probably know it, but if you don't, seek it out. Hell, it'll be the first song on this episode's Spotify playlist. So there. That riff, it all builds to a crescendo, and then there's the outro where Plant goes full screamy mimi, and Page is a true lead guitar sorcerer. Now, sure, I'll tell you now that the album was recorded in a country cottage in Headley, England, and that Sandy Denny of Fairport Convention lends the female vocal touches to the Battle of Evermore. That when the levee breaks is actually a cover of a blues obscurity named Memphis Minnie, and that Boogie with Stu, that weird but fun deep album cut from 1975's Physical Graffiti, was actually recorded during these sessions. I'll also tell you that the album is 24 times platinum certified by the Recording Industry Association of America, and that it reached #1 on the album charts in the UK, though not quite in the US, where it peaked at #2. But ultimately, I don't care all that much about the history. When I listen to Led Zeppelin, I'm still that 15-year-old kid spending his allowance money on CDs and letting my vivid, immature imagination run wild. Man, those drum fills on 4 sticks are really bulls rumbling through Catalonia, man. Led Zeppelin 4 will always be thrilling and never in the most sophisticated of ways. Herein lies an actual teenage wasteland. Arturo, what say you?
Led Zeppelin 4. Yeah, I mean, this and the Who's Next, which you're going to talk about next, those are the very two first albums I ever bought with my own money on cassette at Kmart. And those were my older brothers were never into the Who. I had to get into the Who on my own. They were into Led Zeppelin, and then I followed the Zeppelin trail. And they were never into the Stones. We were going to talk about Sticky Fingers soon. I had to get into the Stones on my own. But yeah, but Zeppelin and the Who, those two albums were the very two first albums I ever bought with my own money.
Well, how about that? Any thoughts on the album itself?
Oh yeah, no. Listen, man. This album itself. Led Zeppelin 4 is the Led Zeppelin album. If you meet anyone, most likely a younger person who's never really been not familiar with Led Zeppelin, this is pretty much the album you play for them. Personally, I would go in chronological order. I would make them start with Led Zeppelin 1 and go down. But really, if you really want to get the encapsulated the encapsulated greatness of Zeppelin, everything that made him great is encapsulated in this one album. And I mean, my personal favorite is still Physical Graffiti, but this is the Led Zeppelin album. And in my list of the 500 greatest albums of all time, it's very, very high, as is this next one you're going to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Next, we're going to actually talk about the Rolling Stones' Sticky Fingers, which I personally feel is the band's best album. Why?
Wrong.
Yeah, I know, but I personally think it's their best album. Why? Because Mick Jagger and Keith Richards deployed their new secret weapon, lead guitarist Mick Taylor, to full effect. Now, Mick Taylor had replaced founding member Brian Jones in 1969, and Jones was a pretty tough act to follow. After all, he's the one that supplied the marimba touches on the brilliant single Under My Thumb and the alto recorder to the equally brilliant Ruby Tuesday.
And played the sitar on Painted Black.
Yep. And his musical sensibilities are also evident on the 1968 classic album Beggar's Banquet, his last volley with the band before his debilitating drug dependency got him fired. There's harmonica on Parachute Woman. There's mellotron on Stray Cat Blues and exotic Indian instrumentation on Street Fighting Man, including a sitar. It's worth remembering that Jones drowned to death about a month after he got fired in 1969, in his swimming pool. Now, how do you replace all of that? By embracing the guitar, of which Taylor was a foremost practitioner. Taylor, he developed his chops and introduced his chops to the larger rock universe as a member of John Mayall's Bluesbreakers, which is a band that Eric Clapton also got his start in. And it's from the Bluesbreakers that the Stones poached him and made him their own. Taylor's playing was powerful, soulful, and elegant, lending a power and agility to Jagger and Richards's increasingly reverent reverence. And yes, there is such a thing as reverent reverence for American blues and roots music in their songwriting style. The band recorded and hell, the band recorded part of the album at Muscle Soul Sound in Alabama. Taylor's solos on Sway, Can You Hear Me Knocking, and Bitch, his slide guitar work on Sister Morphine, and his supple acoustic work on album closer Moonlight Mile are all jaw-dropping. So are the twinkling guitar notes that drive album centerpiece Wild Horses, perhaps Jagger's greatest Stones ballad. Taylor may have lacked Jones' versatility and showiness, but he made up for it with depth and figurative and literal electricity. Jagger and Richards were never ones to lack in swagger. I mean, shit, the first song they ever wrote was As Tears Go By, you know. But the self-confidence just dribbles and drools from the speakers on Sticky Fingers. They're mean, they're lean, they're purposeful, and they're majestical here. And Taylor helps them unleash it better than they ever had prior to Sticky Fingers. Exile on Main Street from the next year is probably objectively a better record, but it's the unwavering cockiness and decadence of this affair that wins me over ultimately. For what it's worth, the album spent a month atop the albums chart in both Britain and the US, and it sits at number 104 on the Rolling Stones 500 albums list.
Too low.
Yeah, I think it's a keeper though, right, Arturo?
No, yeah, I love this record. I mean, it's a 5-star all-time classic.
Five and a half star. Yeah.
5.5. My only complaint about Sticky Fingers is that the track listing is a bit uneven. The second half is a little too mellow, where they front loaded all the rockers on the first half. I wish they would have like evened it out a little bit. Like, for example, the album. I don't want to talk too much about this album because we're going to do so in the next episode in this series. But Exile on Main Street has a perfect flow, you know, and and the track listing is evenly spread out. Same on Let It Bleed. That's why I have Let It Bleed. I rank that higher than Sticky Fingers. Let It Bleed's got this perfectly flowing, even out track listing. Whereas Sticky Fingers, where every song is great, it doesn't flow as much as the other ones do, or as well.
Yeah, I mean, it ends with Moonlight Mile, which is kind of a bum trip,
Right.
you know, compared to stuff that came before it, but it's still great.
Yeah.
You know, it still has kind of it's a surprisingly lovely song.
Sure.
But yeah, the stuff before it, I mean, you got to remember, Bitch is track 6, so it's not like, you know, everything came to a screeching halt. And then Sister Morphine is track 8, and that's pretty rollicking as well. But yeah, to end the album with Dead Flowers and Moonlight Mile is not exactly keeping momentum. But I still maintain it's a beautiful, wonderful, tight, just swaggeringly awesome record, and one of my favorites of all time for sure. And now I've saved the best for last. There's the Who's Next.
Mm-hmm.
And Who's Next is probably one of the 5 greatest albums ever made. I played this album so much during my sophomore year at Syracuse University that my college roommate Ryan eventually grew tired of it. I swear he played bad 1980s Rush as a response just to piss me off too. Yeah, ironically, this album was a happy accident. The remnants of an aborted attempt by band leader Pete Townshend to follow up 1969's Glorious Tommy with yet another soaring rock opera. If his bandmates ultimately thought the piece as a whole, known as Lifehouse, either sucked or was just too abstract or confusing for them to get behind, then I think they were pretty okay with the pieces, given that these pieces stand as universally celebrated and beloved volleys. Think about it. Lifehouse, as I understand it, was Townshend's riff on coming environmental destruction, presenting a world in which we all float along physically in bubbles, detached from one another and our need for human interactivity. In that context, the Who's Next song, Going Mobile, is probably a centerpiece. As it stands on Who's Next, the song is kind of a throwaway, but it's also flippin' brilliant. Featuring maybe Keith Moon's most inspired, most awesome drumming in the Who's entire catalog. That is how deep, rich, and powerful Who's Next is, really, and truly, and ultimately. The album's single most important contribution to the evolution of rock and roll, however, stands in Townshend's astonishing use of synthesizer. His intricate electronic creations may introduce several songs in striking fashion, but they eventually settle into being those songs' rhythm tracks, the spines of some of rock's most notable anthems. On Bob O'Reilly, which opens the record, in which the riff eventually becomes supreme over and above what may be rock's second greatest lead in, the tinkling, twinkling, rum-pum-pum opening synthesizer feast. That feast becomes dessert that sustains the riff once things gets going. The same deal really occurs with album closer Won't Get Fooled Again. Now that is rock's greatest opener. A combo of skittering church-like synth and organ notes that instantly hypnotizes us as the listeners. And then the song gets going, and the whole freaking thing grows orgasmic. A perfectly rocking rumble through regret and longing for transcendence among mundanity and isolation, as shouted sensationally by Roger Daltrey. So there is your album opener and your album closer, the best bread to a rock and roll sandwich ever served up. The meat, for what it's worth, is also sublime and includes the epic power ballad Behind Blue Eyes, the darkly amusing John S. Whistle Rump Shaker, My Wife, and Townshend's beautiful 1-2 ode to music, The Song Is Over and Getting in Tune. My only complaint is that in an era where the release of singles was still a thing, Townshend withheld the songs Pure and Easy and Joined Together from the album. I think with the inclusion of those two, we'd be talking about a consensus #1 album of all time. But as it is, top 5 for me at least ain't bad. Oh, and for what it's worth, the de-whitening of Rolling Stone's voting contingency dropped Who's Next to 77 in the latest edition. But that's okay. I'll accept it. Arturo, what's your thought about Who's Next?
Yeah, Behind Blue Eyes, a song so good that not even Limp Bizkit's terrible version could ruin it in the eyes of most fans.
Nope.
Yeah, no, this is a Pantheon record. It's very, very high in my list it's higher than 77 for sure in the list of the top albums of all time. It is easily, it's weird that this is the Who's greatest album, because this is not what Pete Townshend originally envisioned.
Nope.
These are the scraps of Lifehouse, and just tells you how on it he was during this time. How everything he was doing was amazing. That the scraps of Lifehouse make up the Who's single greatest work and their greatest masterpiece. It's an album that inspired me as a kid. It inspired Eddie Vedder. He's a Who fanatic, he's known as that, and it's inspired multiple generations of music fans and eventual musicians. It's a perfect album from top to bottom. Like, the worst song is a brilliant song and would be most bands' best song. So yeah, I mean, these are Pantheon records for a reason. When I eventually unveil my 500 greatest albums of all time, I'm going to correct the wrong that Rolling Stone did. I'm going to put these albums way up there.
Yeah, definitely higher than 77. Yeah, for sure. So moving on, talking about Pantheon records, we're talking about perhaps the two best female-fronted, or at least white lady female-fronted albums ever made, aren't we, Arturo?
Yeah, the two greatest albums for Karens to weep to.
Yes,
no, but they are great records.
They're astonishingly great records, actually.
They're astonishingly great records. Music in the year 1971 is remembered for many things, but one of the biggest developments of that year is how two women released career and era-defining albums. And the word career is important here. For both Carole King and Joni Mitchell, the albums they each released in 1971 would go on to cast a large shadow over their respective discographies, to such an extent that these two albums would be the only records to identify these artists for some people among future generations of music listeners. For Carole King, this is emphatically so. She was a very successful professional songwriter for hire throughout the 1960s. Along with her then husband, Jerry Goffin, she wrote a seemingly endless string of hit singles for various pop singers and groups during the decade. Chains by the Cookies, The Locomotion by Little Ava, Halfway to Paradise by Tony Orlando, Take Good Care of My Baby by Bobby V, Up on the Roof by the Drifters, I'm Into Something Good by Earl Jean, One Fine Day by the Chiffons, Pleasant Valley Sunday by the Monkees, Going Back by Dusty Springfield, and the immortal classic You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman by Aretha Franklin. Yet the enormous critical and commercial success of King's album, Tapestry, would go on to mostly obscure even that classic period for King as an artist. But really, it's King's post-Tapestry output that would suffer the most from comparisons to a masterpiece and eventual marginalization. For Joni Mitchell, what her 1971 album Blue did to the rest of her catalog wasn't quite as drastic. After all, she would go on to have a few more significant phases in her musical evolution throughout the 1970s, with seminal albums such as the jazzy pop hybrid of 1974's Court and Spark and the art rock textures of 1975's The Hissing of Summer Lawns. Yet even for Mitchell, Blue is the one album that people most associate with her, the one that most people identify with her, and the one that everything she's ever done afterward gets compared to, fairly or unfairly. And you know what? It's understandable. Both albums are towering masterpieces of yearning, emotional, soul-searching folk and pop music that can melt the heart of any cynic, especially this particular curmudgeon who usually dismisses music of this ilk as whiny, mopey, sad sack crap. But nope, not these two records. With King's Tapestry, heartstring pulling ballads like Will You Love Me Tomorrow and So Far Away transcend the maudlin, bland posturing of most of the music from the mellow singer-songwriter era of the early 1970s. It's Too Late may be the most affecting sigh of resignation ever written, a nakedly honest portrayal of a relationship doomed to failure. You've Got a Friend is so touching in its plaintive emotion that it even makes James Taylor, who sings backup on the track, seem tolerable. There are even songs that kind of rock, such as I Feel the Earth Move, Where You Lead, and the not-so-subtle dig at violent country rednecks with Smackwater Jack. Mitchell's Blue is an album of such open chest cavity, raw, heartbroken power that it's a bit overwhelming to listen to once the album is settled into your system after several listens. With her previous albums, whenever Mitchell switched to her whingy, cringy falsetto vocals, it was enough to make you want to stop listening and never listen to her again. But on this album, when the songwriting is this strong and the emotion behind the songs is so gut-punching and overwhelming, the falsetto makes sense and, in fact, works as a kind of catharsis. The yearning lyrics and much improved songwriting, not to mention improved vocalizing, are a wonderful platform for one of Mitchell's most underrated elements to her artistry, and that's her odd and offbeat guitar tunings, which really give each song a different flavor, especially so with the brilliant track Carrie and the heart-melting A Case of You. But honestly, this album is spilling over the brim with brilliant tracks. The subtly rocking, as far as folk music goes, This Flight Tonight, the devastating The Last Time I Saw Richard, the aching longing of California, the lovingly tender piano ballad My Old Man. No, Joni Mitchell's Blue is not the third greatest album of all time, as the latest 2020 edition of Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time ranks it, but it's way up there in my list of the 500 greatest albums of all time, as is Carole King's Tapestry. Chris?
Yeah, they're both way up there for me too. Both a couple of astonishing records that share one thing in common, by the way. Acoustic guitar accompaniment by James Taylor.
Yeah.
He plays on several songs on both records, and Taylor also got a hit, actually a bigger hit than Carole King with "You've Got a Friend."
Right.
Later,
and he was dating Joni Mitchell at this time too.
Yeah, and he dated the first part. He was dating her, and actually, I think they broke up while she was getting ready to release Blue. Right. But they were dating while she was making Blue. So strange but true. Many of the songs on Joni Mitchell's Blue are about Graham Nash and James Taylor. She had interesting tastes in soft rock beacons of hope. Yeah, good stuff. But no, the Carole King record is like beyond perfect. I mean, there's just an assurance to that album that's just fascinating. Even like the cheesiest song on it, which is beautiful. works really, really well as kind of it's a little bit of a feminism anthem
Hmm.
of finding your inner beauty,
Yeah.
but she brings such conviction to it and such a and such an openness and such a an honesty in the vocal performance that it wins you over. The most interesting thing about Tapestry actually is that the fact that she includes her own versions of "Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow" and "You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman,"
Yeah.
and it's just kind of interesting to hear her as a mid-30s divorcee
Mm.
singing those songs that she wrote for that became hits for black women.
She wasn't quite 30 yet when this album came out.
Yeah, so she was still pretty young. I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't realize she was actually that young when she was writing with Goffin,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is it's actually kind of extraordinary now that I think about it. That she, the maturity of the stuff that her and Goffin were doing.
Yeah.
But she strikes out on her own, and so in some ways it's a statement of intent and statement of independence in doing her own thing, and so the confidence is just jaw dropping, as it is with Joni Mitchell's Blue. I mean, but there's a naked rawness to Blue that
Yeah.
there's some great love songs on that record, like My Old Man, which is about Graham
Right.
Nash, by the way, and also A Case of You, which is probably the best song on the record. It's just a great lyric and a great melody and just everything. Uh, I think the most striking thing about Blue is the fact that for the most part it's just her. I mean,
Yeah.
there's some accompaniment. Carrie's got some backup. California's got some backup. I mean, Steve Stills plays bass on one song, but for the most part, it's just her. Either
Mm.
her just playing piano or her playing acoustic guitar, and she mixes in Appalachian dulcimer of all instruments in some of the stuff too. But it's basically just her guitar or her piano and her voice, and she just fills the space, as if she was filling the entire Laurel Canyon. You know, it's pretty amazing accomplishment that it's such a big, ambitious record
Yeah.
done so sparsely.
Right.
And so that contrast has always been kind of amazing to me.
It,
So,
it, it kind of it kind of is like with John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band.
oh yeah,
You know, you
yeah,
know,
it's
big thematic record done small.
yeah, absolutely. And although in some ways it's kind of funny, like Plastic Ono Band is actually a quieter album than Blue,
Yeah.
even though it's electric guitar, and it actually stands as a quieter record. So quite a contrast. But anyway, Blue and Tapestry, yeah, putting them together makes sense because you're talking like feminine might,
Mm.
and I don't think, yeah, I think on the latest, yeah, the highest ranking album by a woman is Joni's Blue. I think the second highest rated uh, song album by a woman is Lauryn Hill,
Yep.
who
Yeah.
came in at number 10. The
Right.
Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. Tapestry came in at 25,
Mm.
and Tapestry actually it went up. 2012 it was 36,
Yeah.
and it went up to 25, and so you're talking like literally like in the consensus, two of the three best female uh, fronted albums of all time, and they both came out in the early part of 1971, which is kind of
Mm.
amazing.
Right. Well, next, the goodness of 1971 continues. This is an album that actually was the number one album of all time in Rolling Stone's recent list. Chris?
Yeah, Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On," which deserves its flowers in a lot of ways, although maybe not that. So Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On" replaced the Beatles' "Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band" as the number one album on Rolling Stone's 2020 update of that list of the 500 greatest albums ever made. Uh, Sgt. Pepper's actually fell all the way to 24,
Yeah.
which is kind of amazing. Now, reasonable people can disagree with the switch, and for what it's worth, I personally think Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited belongs in the top spot. But really, all three albums belong in anyone's short list of the true greats. So there's that. But one thing I can say about What's Going On, though, is that its origin story is among rock's best, and is probably among its most important.
Yeah.
Marvin Gaye, of course, was a product of the Motown hit factory of the 1960s, having scored notable hits written by the label's powerhouse songwriters, including How Sweet It Is, Ain't No Mountain High Enough, and I Heard It Through the Grapevine. But as the 60s came to a close, Gaye was growing as an artist and as a man. His soul was restless, perhaps informed by the grief of losing singing partner and artistic muse Tammy Terrell to cancer. He was exploring new things to say and new ways to say it. Now, we can say a lot of things about Motown. We can't necessarily, but we cannot necessarily say that Berry Gordy's Juggernaut was overly chanty. His people created a pop music formula that presented soul music for consumption by a wide audience. It was revolutionary still, but it also, for the most part, was safe. There was my guy and my girl and all the sentiments in between. One thing they didn't touch through their whole run on the top of the charts through the 1960s, basically, was the actual condition of a large portion of Black America. Concentrated poverty, the crushing weight of systemic racism, the hopelessness of drug addiction, the environmental degradation of the inner city. By the turn of the decade, it was all weighing on Marvin Gaye's sensitive artistic soul. And so there was one night early in 1971 or late 1970, actually, that he took to the studio to work on the title song to What's Going On, which was a mournful tune borrowed from free jazz as much as it borrowed from soul. The song was somehow intense and laid back simultaneously, driven both by the wondrous bass work of James Jamerson and by the rhythmic 1-2 punch of bongos and saxophone. It's one of the greatest pop songs ever recorded, and Berry Gordy hated it. To borrow a phrase from the critic Roger Ebert, he hated it. This was not Motown. This wasn't in line with the studio protocol. What is this protesty anti-war, anti-police shit? Gaye responded by essentially holding out any future work from Motown in the wake of Gordy refusing to release it. And when the label finally did relent and released the song as a single in January 1971, hey, surprise, surprise, it sold 100,000 copies the first week. That led Berry Gordy to give up the control game and let Gaye record the next Marvin Gaye albums on Marvin Gaye's own terms and under Marvin Gaye's artistic control as both writer and performer. Imagine the balls it took for the artist to stand up to the music business Genghis Khan. Wow. The album What's Going On builds on the single's Lounge Warrior vibe, presenting as a continuous song cycle that sounds like the most meaningful jam session imaginable. The chimes, the horns, the congas, the bongos, the bass riffs, and Gaye's reverb-heavy vocals weave in and out to create an incredibly soulful tapestry. The album's sequencing of one song to the next exudes a feeling of floating through the proceedings. The end of the record is particularly magnificent, closing with two numbers that couldn't be more different. First, there's the exquisite string-laden ballad, Holy, Holy, which features the sad-faced line, Jesus left a long time ago, said he would return, left us a book to believe in, and we have a lot to learn. That leads into my favorite song on the album, the absolutely amazing Inner City Blues Make Me Wanna Holler. The song's arrangement and performance are absolutely just extraordinary, with the bass punching through swaying, breezy conga, and Gaye's overdubbed vocal harmonies giving his ghetto poverty and violence lament an extraterrestrial quality. There's also his little yelps and coos throughout that punctuate his verses and choruses. Combined with a brief reprise outro of What's Going On, it stands as one of the great album closers. So What's Going On really is a singular achievement in musical history. Is it the best album in history? Again, reasonable minds can disagree. But you at least won't get a specific reaction out of me if it stands as your own number one. It certainly belongs near the top. Now, doesn't it, Arturo?
Yeah, it's not the number one greatest album of all time. I'm one of the reasonable minds who will disagree. I think it's a top 40 all-time record. Mm-hmm. I think it's definitely in the top 40, maybe top 30. But one of the things, what sinks this album for me, there's one track that I find unlistenably bad, and that's track 4, Save the Children, which may be one of the corniest, cheesiest songs ever written. He could have just deleted the song from the entire album. It's just what kills this song for me is the call and response vocals between spoken word and sung vocals that Gaye puts on. Yeah. The absolute banal trite cheesiness of the lyrics when he's going on, what is he saying? Like save the children, save the children. Little children today are really going to suffer tomorrow, really suffer tomorrow. It's like, for fuck's sake, dude. That is terrible. I'm sorry. That should not be on an album that's considered the greatest album of all time. It's the one track that freaking kills, that really sinks this record for me a little bit, even though everything else is perfect. Everything else is amazing. But save the children is really, really bad.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that whole, like you said, the call and response thing is cheesy, but I do like the music to that song. I think that just musically,
I think it's overly ethereal. There's not enough grit and backbone to it, like most of the album, like the rest of the album has. And it doesn't really have it. But the call and response, spoken word and sung vocals, it's real. People, listen to it and read the lyrics, and then you're gonna wince. You're gonna cringe. Trust me.
Oh, I mean, okay. Really is. Spoken like a true curmudgeon. What would the Curmudgeon Rock Report be without a couple of curmudgeons just taking a good shit on a corny ass song?
On this episode, our second Golden Age of Rock series neared its end by looking back on the year 1971. For the next episode, we're going back to another one of our series, this time our ongoing hip-hop series. The historical timeline takes us to the 1990s as, much like rock, hip-hop undergoes a serious shift toward a darker and angrier tone. And in hip-hop's case, it sometimes got even more violent. We're talking about the era where hardcore hip-hop crossed over from the fringes into the center of the mainstream as gangsta rap became a household word. In the West Coast, you have Dr. Dre, the rise of Snoop Dogg, and the arrival of a certain East Coast transplant by the name of Tupac Shakur, all eventually signing to Death Row Records, headed by the controversial Suge Knight. Then there's the East Coast, New York City response, with classic albums by the Wu-Tang Clan, Nas, and the Notorious B.I.G. And then, of course, there's the ensuing epic and tragic feud between Tupac and Biggie that arguably ended an era and altered the course of the genre's history. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you Hardcore Hip Hop Goes Mainstream, 1992 to 1998.
Oh, goodness.
But you know what's not corny? Ain't nothing corny about the next two albums we're going to talk about.
Right. This is where funk gets dark, right?
Yeah. As the late 1960s turned into the early 1970s, things in the socio-political climate got dark, especially in the US. The Vietnam War was still going on. The civil rights movement had made some advancements, but not enough for large sections of the population. And the idealistic hippie dream had eroded into just a memory. A lot of the music of the time reflected this grim nature, especially in rock. Bands like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath had introduced a new dark and heavy sound, and established bands such as the Rolling Stones and the Who had begun to venture into, well, darker and heavier territory, both musically and lyrically. This reflection was now beginning to show in quote-unquote Black American music, which at the time was R&B, soul, and funk. Two bands in particular, Funkadelic and Sly and the Family Stone, each released albums in 1971 that captured the darkening mood and disillusionment of the times. The former did so with the album Maggot Brained, and in a more subtle, less obvious, slightly surrealist sense. The latter did so with There's a Riot Going On, and in a more direct way with an album full of ominous dread, murky textures, and drug-induced paranoia. While not yet a huge commercial success, that would come later in the decade, George Clinton's Funkadelic project had by this time earned quite a reputation among music media and hardcore music fans for their groundbreaking mixture of R&B, soul, funk, and groovy rock and roll. They even had a more notorious reputation for their wild, drugged-out live performances. But in no way did the antics and notoriety cover up what people in the know knew, that Clinton was a music visionary ahead of his time, and his band was full of amazing musicians, some of them even virtuosos. That's especially true with Funkadelic guitarist Eddie Hazel, a Hendrix-esque prodigy whose claim to immortality is the album's opener and title track, a 10-minute guitar solo of slow, searing, molten lava beauty that stands as one of the greatest instrumental moments of any genre of music in the 20th century. True story. Right before Clinton pressed record in the mixing booth, Hazel asked him what he wanted this solo to sound like. Clinton replied to play as if he had just heard his mother died. Also, Clinton was allegedly high on LSD when the recording took place. And yes, it was all done in one take, with Clinton adding several sound effects later in the mix. But this isn't one of the greatest albums of all time because of just one song. Can You Get to That creeps along in what can be called country funk with its acoustic guitars. You and Your Folks, Me and My Folks brings the funk to steamy, sweaty proportions. Super Stupid is a righteous slice of thick as fuck rock, as if Sly Stone was pumped up with Led Zeppelin juice. The 9.5-minute epic that ends the album, Wars of Armageddon, makes the socio-political subtext a little more overt, but is nonetheless a funk jam of vicious proportions with an equally vicious guitar solo by Hazel. Before I jump into Sly Stone's There's a Riot Going On, what say you about Maggot Brain, Chris?
Oh, great album, great album. This is what happens when a bunch of well-trained R&B musicians from Detroit take a bunch of acid and decide to make hard rock. And it's just incredible stuff. I mean, like I said, you said Eddie Hazel is just a legend on this album. I'm a huge fan of the song Super Stupid, which is the smartest song ever called Super Stupid. Ever made. And it just there's just a swagger and a swing to a lot of this stuff that's on this record. Like Hit It and Quit It is also a lot of fun too.
Right.
And it just so it begins with Maggot Brain and ends with Wars of Armageddon. Now that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
That's just awesome. And so it's one of the great black rock albums. If you were to have a category of black rock, Maggot Brain might be number one.
No, Hendrix.
Hendrix. Okay, they might. They're in the non-Hendrix, non-Prince division. Maggot Brain would probably stand at the top.
Right.
That's how good the record is.
Speaking of artists who influenced Prince, not just George Clinton, but Sly Stone. As for Sly Stone, by the time of the release of There's a Riot Going On, he was already a superstar. Between 1967 to 70, Sly and the Family Stone had recorded 4 songs and had 4 songs in the top 10 of the Billboard pop chart, with 2 of them, Everyday People and Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself Again, reaching number 1. But on the road to stardom, Stone, like many of his peers at the time, succumbed to drug addiction, and in his case, he had become a raging cocaine addict. It's hard to separate the paranoia and sense of the world being off-kilter that you get from that drug from the overall claustrophobia that the record evokes. Even though the album's lead single, the delicious mid-tempo funk of Family Affair, became Stone's 3rd number 1 hit in the US, the album as a whole isn't a record of songs as much as it is a record of 12 separate grooves, just grooving along under the weight of some seriously murky production. But by God, are those grooves amazing. And the murkiness in the sound, rather than being a turnoff for the ear, actually imbues the overall record with a glazy, gossamer sheen, making the album thoroughly unique and special in a year of incredibly great albums. Album opener Love and Hate, spelled Haight and referring to the hippie haven Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, tips Stone's hand as to his commentary on his disillusionment with the hippie counterculture. Poet is creamy funk with glistening keyboards, while Africa Talks to You, the Asphalt Jungle, reflects Stone's at the time interest in the Black Panther Party's radical politics and its return to Africa polemic. One of the album's most celebrated and dynamic features is the use of drum machines and electronic textures, particularly
Yeah.
on tracks such as Africa Talks to You, Time, and the ultra loopy Spaced Cowboy, which presaged and predicted the genres of EDM and hip hop by several years. By the time you're done with the final track, the hard funk workout, Thank You for Talking to Me, Africa, driven by Larry Graham's insistent head pounding bass playing, you realize that you've just heard one of the defining R&B funk albums of the era, an album whose sensual textures and innovative use of electronics paved the way for the future, and an album that reveals its timeless perfection with each listen. Chris?
Yeah, one great bass lick after another.
Yeah.
It's one of the great bass records of the 1970s, and
This is Larry Graham's like coming out
yeah,
party.
Larry Graham is just awesome, and so like just the bass licks on this give a texture, and so then there's a juxtaposition between all those bass licks and those croaking vocals. By this point, Sly Stone is croaking
Yeah.
as much as he is singing, and
Cocaine is a hell of a drug.
yeah, absolutely. And so the gloomy croaking mixed with the sort of the uplifting bass licks, there's a juxtaposition there that really just kind of makes it a, like you said, a really striking listen.
Yeah.
It's unique. It's probably like, as funk albums goes, it's like depressing funk.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like despondent funk.
This isn't
Uh,
James Brown.
no, it is not James Brown. It's not even Curtis Mayfield. It is depressing funk. And as depressing funk artists go, Sly and the Family Stone at this point, they were pretty damn good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, I've forgotten. You hear some of that, some of the songs that have the drum machines on them, and it's like, wow, this was 1971,
Yeah.
and you're getting this kind of drum machine stuff that became, kind of the thing by like 1979, and they're doing it in 1971. So definitely ahead of their time on that front for sure.
All right. So next, now we're going to get out of the funk and the R&B spectrum. We're going diving back into the rock spectrum, but a different kind of rock that was kind of birthed this year, what we now call shock rock. And the guy who pretty much started it all, Alice Cooper. Chris, tell us
Yes,
about Alice Cooper.
and actually,
Vince, what's his real name? Vincent Furnier?
Vincent Furnier. Yep.
Yeah.
And originally from Detroit, Michigan, grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. And Alice Cooper was actually a band
Yeah.
at first.
It was the Alice Cooper Group. That was the name.
Yeah, at first. So there you go. So let's talk about Alice Cooper. Alice Cooper, the guy in the gothic stage makeup who threw a live chicken into a Toronto audience in 1969 and regularly faked his own electrocution on stage, owes his career in large part and in large measure to Frank Zappa. Yep,
Mm.
it's strange, but it's true. Zappa
Yeah.
was a composer's composer and a straight-edged liver of his life, but he, of course, possessed satirical wit and a fondness for toilet, titty, and other forms of scatological humor. He was different, and he appreciated different when he saw it. And Alice Cooper certainly was different. Actually, Alice Cooper actually started out as a band rather than as just a guy.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
guy Alice Cooper was born Vincent Furnier and formed the band that eventually became Alice Cooper with high school friends in Phoenix, Arizona in the late 1960s. While their original song and their original style can charitably be described as freak flag psychedelic slop, they show theatrical leanings early on, often wearing makeup and women's clothing and showing off sensibilities that lean towards horror film schlock. The band moved to LA to find its fame and its fortune, and through a mutual connection, found itself auditioning for Zappa accidentally at 7 a.m. in the morning. True story. They were told to be at Zappa's house by 7, so they showed up at 7 a.m. as opposed to 7 p.m. Imagine waking up that early to Alice Cooper in your living room, right? Well, hey, it worked. And Zappa signed the band to his Straight Records label. The first couple of Alice Cooper albums bombed commercially, and disillusioned with and ill-fitted with LA, the band relocated to Furnier's original hometown of Detroit, Michigan. There, they found a scene much more attuned to its grittier, edgier stylings. they became peers with bands like MC5 and the Stooges, who also had a hard in-your-face edge that relied as much on stage chaos as anything that came out of the amps. The band also hooked up with a very, very young Bob Ezrin, who by the end of the 70s was one of the preeminent hard rock super producers. Ezrin helped the band focus that music into leaner and meaner constructions that emphasized a more metallic, more blue-collar edge. The result of Alice Cooper's newfound scene, discipline, and sound was two 1971 albums, Love It to Death and Killer, that together catapulted Alice Cooper, the band, and the guy into stardom. They owe much of that to the success of to the run of Love It to Death's hit single, I'm 18, an undeniably crunchy anthem and ode to restless youth. Its Hall of Fame riffage and Fournier's snarling vocals made the song instantly iconic, and the song charted as high as number 21 on the American pop charts. With the greater success came greater money and naturally a greater performance budget. Hence, here came the boa constrictors and the electric chairs and the straitjacket wearing set pieces. I can only imagine being in an Alice Cooper show in 1971 when they started playing the 9-minute Deep Purple aping epic Black Juju and watching near song's end as and seeing Fournier as the titular Mr. Cooper start faux frying in an electric chair. At the time, such shock rock antics were practically unprecedented. I'd have been like, yeah, fucking A, awesome. What a goddamn show. Woo!
Yeah.
Without Alice Cooper, simply, we don't get Kiss, and we don't get Marilyn Manson, and we don't get hundreds of other bands that wore elaborate costumes and pretended to worship the occult on stage. Yeah. Cooper and mates taught everyone how it was done at an arena-level scale. These heightened theatrical over-the-top shows made Fournier and his bandmates instantly iconic, and Cooper found himself propelled into celebrity and the alcohol-fueled fog that came with it. While he has sobered up and found Jesus Christ in the decades since, the persona of Alice Cooper continues to define him, so much that he changed his legal name to Alice Cooper in 1974, mainly to keep the identity after the band broke up, but also because, hey, he was Alice fucking Cooper. At that point. We have a feeling, coincidentally, that you're much more familiar with Alice Cooper, the persona, than you are with either of the band's 1971 albums. They're both worth checking out, as they are the work of a finely tuned, tight, punkish proto-metal band. If it reminds you of the punk rock that came forth from the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, and others, well, that's not really an accident, as those bands went on record as citing Cooper's music as an influence on their own explosive fare. Me personally, I'm a fan of Under the Wheels, or Under My Wheels, the horn-inflected banger of a lead song from Killer, which is a dopey, bouncy, menacing, and just mad fun song. Check the records out, and in your downtime this week, express some gratitude for Alice Cooper and what he brought to the rock and roll dance. Arturo, yeah. What's your thought on Alice Cooper?
Yeah, I mean, Alice Cooper is an important figure in rock history. His breakout was in 1971, and he deserves to be discussed, and he has his place in history. Personally, I've never been the world's biggest Cooper fan. I will admit Love It to Death is a great album, and I think it's still his best album. As for Killer, I think it's just an okay record. I'm going to quote our favorite music critic, Chris.
Who's that?
Robert Christgau. This is what he says about Killer. In his quote, "A taste for the base usages of hard rock rarely comes with a hit attached these days, much less surreal, theatrical, and let us not forget, quote unquote, transvestite trappings, which is why some desperate rock and rollers have convinced themselves their prayers are being answered. But while this is the band's most song-oriented LP, it falters after Under My Wheels and Be My Lover, neither of them and I'm 18 in the human outreach department. And only one of the three theatrical extravaganzas, Dead Babies, works on record, never mind in the theater. B-.
Ouch. Jeez. Yeah. You sure that's not a C-, Bob?
Yeah, I know. It doesn't sound like a B-.
That doesn't really sound like a B-. I mean, I guess he's great. He must be grading on a curve. Yeah. Wow. Oh, I was gonna say, wow. So he wasn't exactly a critical darling. Yeah, especially after he went solo. And yeah, he did have Welcome to My Nightmare,
Yeah.
but other than that, it's just like meh, it's just very very not great stuff. And he became kind of generic.
He
If,
did. Yeah. He
if
became a
anything,
parody. He became a parody of himself.
yeah, by 1985, he was a second-rate Ozzy Osbourne.
Yeah.
Well, more like a fourth-rate Ozzy Osbourne, you
Yeah, I
know.
know.
But hey, he gets to play a shitload of golf, and he's been married to the same hot woman for 50 years. So God bless Vince Fernier,
Good.
the
Yeah, good for
former
him.
Vince Fernier.
Right. Now, speaking of flamboyant, extravagant, theatrical rock,
Yeah.
now we get to the birth of glam rock. In 1971, kind of is year zero, ground zero for that.
Yep.
In the UK, the early 1970s saw a rock movement rise up that served as an alternative to the then stale hippie jam rock and the burgeoning, insufferable, and pompous prog rock of the day. This kind of rock, like I said, was sexy, flamboyant, willfully androgynous, defiantly homoerotic, and insistent on short singles rather than the multi-sectioned, overly complex, overly long opuses that many bands were trading in during the period. This kind of rock, like I said, was called glam rock, and the names who would forever be most identified with this subgenre were David Bowie and Mark Bolan, the latter more commonly known to casual music fans as his band slash project T-Rex. Bowie would go on to transcend glam rock and become a global superstar whose visionary and pioneering music would transcend genres and generational fandom. As for Bolan, his rise to fame and success in the early part of the 1970s was meteoric and almost Beatlesque, but ego, drugs, and an unwillingness to experiment with his sound translated to a quick decline in his popularity until his tragic death in a car accident in 1977. However, in 1971, both released albums that essentially kickstarted glam rock. To be honest, T-Rex got there a little earlier than Bowie did.
Yeah.
But Bolan's road to glam rock glory was a long, weird, and winding one. He started out in the hippie era of the 1960s as part of a folk duo called Tyrannosaurus Rex, consisting of Bolan on acoustic guitar and vocals and Steve Peregrine Took playing the bongos. From 1968 to 1970, they released 4 albums of whimsical fairy tale nonsense, songs about elves, gnomes, princesses, rainbows,
Unicorn.
stars, and unicorns. Basically, it was like Syd Barrett with more vocal talent and a better knack for melody. This is the actual name of their 1968 debut album. My people were fair and had sky in their hair, but now they're content to wear stars on their brows. By the time of their second
Cute.
album, they had learned a better sense of economy. The name? Prophets, seers, and sages, the angels of the ages. in any in any case, Bolan wasn't having any hits with his mystic hippie shtick, so a change in musical direction was in order. He shortened the band's name to T-Rex, started mixing in some electric guitar with his acoustic, and actually got someone to play drums and bass, got a couple of people to play drums and bass in the studio. The result was the album T-Rex, and it's an enjoyable if uneven record. On it, Bolan clearly has one foot in the acoustic hippie fairy tales of his previous work and one foot in an increasingly electric boogie rock direction. However, the most important development from the sessions for this album, and one that boosted the album to number 7 in the UK albums chart, was the standalone single that emerged from the sessions and didn't make it on the album, Ride a White Swan. With 4 layered electric guitars, a bass, a small string section, and with a synchronized tambourine and hand claps replacing drums for percussion, glam rock was basically born with this juicy piece of sugared ear candy. The mythological references of Bolan's earlier hippie folk period are still present, but the song itself is simple, pared down, and instantly catchy, especially with Bolan's da-dee-dee-da chant toward the end. The song climbed all the way to number 2 in the UK singles chart, and T-Rex and Mark Bolan in particular were stars. What really kicked off T-Rex mania, or T-Rextasy, as the British media called it, was another standalone single, Hot Love, released in 1971 and soaring all the way to number 1, Bolan's first of several number 1s he would have in his native England. It had a similar beat and tempo to Ride a White Swan, except this time with a full drum kit, and the sing-along at the end got extended to a full la 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 chorus that took up the entire second half of the nearly 5-minute song, kind of like a more effeminate Hey Jude. When T-Rex appeared on the BBC's Top of the Pops show with Bolan dolled up in a shiny satin outfit and glittery makeup, glam rock had its official look and poster boy. Bolan needed a full-length album to validate his newfound success, and he did so later in the year when T-Rex put out what would prove to be Bolan's enduring masterpiece, Electric Warrior. Tight, concise, well-structured boogie-woogie rock and roll with catchy melodies and earworm hooks. The album was a sensation that took the UK and Europe by storm, charting high in numerous countries and producing 2 massive hits with Get It On and the glammed-up Chuck Berry choogle of Jeepster. Get It On even became a big hit in the US, reaching number 10 in the Billboard singles chart. Yes, folks, you know this song. It has one of the most identifiable guitar riffs in history, stolen by Noel Gallagher for Oasis's Cigarettes and Alcohol, and it swings with a hip-swiveling shake that's unavoidable. It's actually the album itself, Electric Warriors, are actually a very rich, stylistically diverse record, with the orchestral folk of Cosmic Dancer threatening to elevate itself to the stars, the smooth R&B soul of Monolith with its lovely backing vocals add panache to the album's overall thread, while Lean Woman Blues sounds exactly like what the title suggests. Girl, the song, harkens back to Bolan's earlier sound, but with substantially better lyrics, while Rip Off is as raw and engagingly aggressive as anything Bolan ever did. It's a perfect album from top to bottom, and T-Rex would never match this or never reach this height again. Chris, what do you say about Electric Warrior?
Great album. I think the secret lies in the use of percussion on it. I think that there's a texture that adds, and there's just a swing that adds, and a confidence that just sort of pops out of the speakers. So I've always enjoyed the record. Always been a big fan of songs like Jeepster, and huge fan of the album opener Mambo Sun. That just has a swing to it that I think that it was just kind of a strange, with the glam rock. So you had the guitars, the guitar sheen, mixed with the percussion. And then speaking of croakers, Bolan was a mighty fine croaker. And so you put all that together and you get a really sensual, surprisingly sexy brew of styles. And it's again, the unifiers are Bolan's voice and the percussions. And the percussion sounds on this record, and it's just really, really, really strong. Always been a huge fan of this record, and it's too bad that they never really reached these heights again. I mean, it's a lightning in a bottle record if there ever was one.
Yeah, it really was. Now, as for David Bowie, like Mark Bolan, he was kicking around quite a bit in the 1960s, trying different musical and artistic guises until he found his place. He went from R&B combos to something akin to English music hall pop to even performing as a mime until he scored a top 10 hit in the UK in 1969 with Space Oddity. Yes, folks, you know this one as well. It's the one about the astronaut Major Tom getting cut off from his spaceship and gets lost in space. This haunting, beautifully orchestrated and arranged piece of psychedelic folk was actually Bowie's only hit for a couple of years, and he was on the verge of being forever relegated to one-hit status by the time the album Hunky Dory came out in late 1971. Now, before that, what changed Bowie's fortunes? Well, enter new management in the form of Tony DeFries. Starting in 1970, Bowie being more open about his bisexuality and actually wearing dresses in public, which got him a lot of media attention and notoriety. And the startling mixture of progressive rock, heavy metal, and dark philosophical dread that was the 1970 album The Man Who Sold the World. While the album wasn't a commercial success, it showed how musically versatile and lyrically compelling Bowie could be. More importantly, it started a musical partnership with guitarist Mick Ronson that would help define Bowie's music for the next several years. The music that made up the album Hunky Dory was another extremely vital step in Bowie's musical evolution. And while it didn't sell many copies, it was highly acclaimed, even revered by many music critics, creating a sort of cult following for Bowie. It proved to Bowie that he was on the right path and was the launching pad for his huge and historic crossover success the following year, which we will talk about in the
Yes, we
next
will.
installment
Yes,
of
we
this
will.
series.
Ziggy Stardust. Yep.
Right. As for Hunky Dory, the album itself, it's a rather odd album for being considered one of the two cornerstone records that kicked off the glam rock movement in 1971. Yes, it has that iconic cover with Bowie emulating a glamorous photo of Marlena Dietrich, but it's heavily piano based with some complex chord progressions and even a jazzy feel throughout much of it. But boy, are some of the songs just gorgeous. The anthemic Changes and its ode to the necessity for artistic reinvention is the album's best known track, as well as a virtual slogan song for Bowie's whole career. However, better tracks abound, especially with the soaring, exquisitely arranged Life on Mars. While musically conceived as a parody of Frank Sinatra, lyrically it moves from one young girl's obsession with the images she sees on movie screens to a desire to get away from the drudgery of life and the cruelty of human nature. Musically, Oh You Pretty Things resembles the mid-tempo vaudeville show tune structure of the Beatles' Martha My Dear, but lyrically, Bowie goes deeper than Paul McCartney ever does. Adopting philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of a master race of humans taking over the world, the Superman, if you will, and unfortunately the basis for much of Nazi fascist ideology, Bowie transforms it into what I interpret as a rousing song of solidarity with the LGBT community. Gotta love the ambiguity of words like gotta make way for the homo superior. The album isn't all pianos, though. Queen Bitch opens with a strutting two-chord guitar riff and sounds like the ode to Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground that it actually really is, sounding not out of place on the Velvet Underground's Loaded album from the previous. And it's glam rock, all right, with the lyrics' main character's gender not being identified and talking about their male lover having affairs with drag queens on the side. Andy Warhol, with its jaunty all-acoustic guitar arrangement, manages to be an ode to someone who is clearly one of Bowie's artistic heroes, while at the same time it satirizes him. Warhol himself allegedly hated the song. All in all, Hunky Dory is Bowie's first masterpiece of several throughout the decade, and quite possibly the purest distillation and representation of Bowie as Bowie the singer-songwriter rather than Bowie the sonic architect and visionary, which is what he would become in the near future. Chris, what do you say about Hunky Dory?
Great album. I agree with pretty much everything you just said about it. I think that "Oh You Pretty Things" and "Life on Mars" are among Bowie's best songs
Yeah.
of his entire catalog. I think that there's a beauty on this record, and it's almost kind of a because of its there's a slyness to it, but it's just a really pretty album, and in some ways it's kind of a spooky record in the sense of how androgynous the presentation is, and just how lilting some of it is, and Bowie's vocals actually are really strong on the record too. I've always enjoyed his vocal performance on Changes,
Yeah.
and especially Life on Mars. That song is just perfect.
Yeah.
And
Covered
just
many times by the band Fish.
yeah, absolutely. I'm actually surprised that they haven't performed this entire album
Yeah.
live, because it would fit. It would definitely fit their format. So yeah, this was definitely the beginning of a special period for Bowie. I mean, basically from 1971 all the way through 1980,
Yeah.
everything he touched, he mastered.
Right.
Whether it was this glam rock, or whether it was the sort of the soul, white boy soul that he did with Young Americans,
The electronica stuff.
and then the stuff that he did in Berlin, and then even Scary Monsters, which is a great
Yeah.
record. So Yeah, this was the beginning of a period where he could do no wrong and became one of the greatest artists of the 70s. And 71 is where it started, man. Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
So like we said, folks, 1971 is a loaded freaking year. And we talked about a lot of albums. There are a lot more that deserve to be talked about. So we're going to do a little lightning round of other all-time great albums that came out this season. And we're going to start off with one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time. Chris?
Yeah, Black Sabbath's Master of Reality. I love Master of Reality. I'd actually rank it as the second best heavy metal album of all time, just behind Metallica's Master of Puppets. I just love how brazen and bold and weird the album is, how meaty its riffage is, how dark and strange the afterlife-focused lyrics are. I even loved a couple of throwaway Tony Iommi instrumentals because, again, they're just so spooky and weird.
Yeah.
The band now, of course, had itself a hell of a 1970, as we talked about on the 1970 episode of this here Second Golden Age of Rock series. They basically arrived on the scene with two marvelous proto-metal albums that immediately gained a following and even a few near hits. The band could have struck while the iron was hot and pumped out 5 variations of Paranoid and 5 more variations of Iron Man, but instead they started their next album with an ode to smoking weed, an almighty sludge fest called Sweet Leaf. Yes, Black Sabbath embraced relative fame by effectively inventing stoner rock. The rest of the album turns its focus away from weed and towards the battle of good versus evil, in which evil keeps seeming to win at every turn. Titles like Children of the Grave, After Forever, and Lord of This World serve to show just where lyricist and bassist Geezer Butler's head was at during this era. But hey, it was perfect fodder to serve the singer and resident iconoclast Ozzy Osbourne. Yeah! That's pretty much how every verse ends on this album.
Yeah!
I love it. I absolutely love it. Great album.
Yeah.
What do you say?
Yeah, no, this is Paranoid is objectively probably the better album and the more important album. Really, Paranoid is one of the most important rock albums of all time. But yeah, this one is probably my personal favorite. The riffs are sludgier. Everything's got this really stoner haze over it. Therefore, the invention of stoner metal. And a lot of the lyrics reference Christianity, especially songs like "Lord of This World" and "After Forever." And Geezer Butler, who was the main lyricist in Sabbath, said it. It was basically to counteract a lot of the accusations the band were getting as being a satanic band, which they really weren't at all. Nope. None of the 4 members were into black magic or the occult. For that, you go to Jimmy Page. He was into that stuff.
Yeah.
But none of the members of Sabbath were, and that was Butler's attempt to get away, to deflect that criticism, hence why you see so much Christian references in the lyrics in Master of Reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And it works, it's good versus evil as told through a Christian lens. Yeah. And so just neat stuff. Right. Love it. All right. So next album.
Yes. Can, the German band Can, Tago Mago. When it comes to 1970s progressive rock, I've always been a strong critic of the British variety. For the most part, it's needlessly complex, unlistenable, impenetrable rubbish from a bunch of art school twats who are too obsessed with showing off their technical virtuosity and instrumental prowess. However, as we went into detail way back in an episode called A Krautrock Exploration, yes, that's a hint for you, the listener, to explore the Curmudgeon Rock Report library, we expressed our deep appreciation for the German brand of prog rock, and Can were the biggest and greatest of them all. Can were a band of musicians who actually were classically trained, but yet didn't feel the need to put classical music affectations in their style of rock. Instead, they went for pure sonic innovation, musical experimentation, and a sound unlike any other band at the time, a sound that was extremely influential to multiple ensuing generations of rock artists. Their double album of 1971, Tago Mago, is considered by many to be their greatest album. While I don't go quite that far, it is an astounding art rock magnum opus and perhaps the purest representation of their vintage patented sound, with guitarist Michael Carole's utterly original approach to the guitar, with liquidy, shimmering tones, with bassist Holger Schukai's unconventional approach to the instrument, informed by his background in avant-garde classical music, creating an idiosyncratic yet oddly hypnotic groove, with drummer Jackie Liebezeit's subtle, jazz-educated skills being inverted to serve repetitive rhythms, with keyboardist Ermin Schmidt's aggressive approach to keyboards, adding unusual textures and often being a lead instrument itself, all combining to create a sound that made an art form out of improvisation, to make the chaotic seem structured, to make delectable interstellar cosmic rock. Disc 1 is the perfect one and the one with the deep pulsating grooves, while Disc 2 has all the weird, wacky, experimental stuff. Both are essential listening. Chris?
Yeah, there is some epic jam shit on this record, for sure. And it has to be said, and we kind of made the point on that krautrock episode that early stage krautrock, which is late 60s, very early 70s, owes a really strong debt of gratitude to the Grateful Dead. That the Grateful Dead and that their experimental and jam leanings really kind of informed what the Germans were doing in their scene at first, and I think you can hear some of that Dead influence on an album like Tago Mago, where you get these 18-minute long kind of freak out, tightly controlled but still freak out. And I think that the Dead are definitely a spiritual cousin to the krautrockers, and that's pretty evident on Tago Mago. Great record.
All right, now we move on to Motown, and Motown reaches its adult period. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. The Temptations' Sky's the Limit. Sky's the Limit is probably closer to what Berry Gordy had in mind for his Motown machine entering 1971, an album mostly composed of ballads written by Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong and sung beautifully by lead singer Eddie Kendricks in what would be his final album with the Temptations. The record includes the timeless classic Just My Imagination, Running Away with Me, which was a #1 hit for the group in 71. Now, this album,
covered very well by the Rolling Stones later on.
Yeah, they did Ain't Too Proud to Beg as well.
But they also, they did 2 Temptation songs. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now this album wasn't What's Going On, of course. I mean, nothing else was, but it was still a great album in the Motown tradition. Well, not completely. I'm sure Gaye's successful release of What's Going On, the single, probably helped the rollicking, fever-pitched African music-inspired song Ungena Za Olimwengu, Unite the World, make it onto the album, which was released in April of 71, a few months after the release of the successful What's Going On single. That song actually asks in its lyrics, will the Russians hit the button? Even the Temps must have felt a little bit liberated by Marvin Gaye's success, right, Arturo?
Oh, yeah. This is a fantastic record. What strikes me about this one is the arrangements, Whitfield's arrangements. Because by this point, Whitfield and Strong were as much, if not more, Temptations than the Temptations themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
These are pretty much Norman Whitfield albums, more than they are Temptations records. And it's very expansive. There's a lot of space in this record, which is what I appreciate a lot. They did some great albums too. Psychedelic Shack the year before is really good, but this is probably the single best studio album by the Temptations.
Yeah. There really is kind of inspiring, and Eddie Kendricks is at his best as a vocalist for sure.
Yeah.
Which is kind
Yeah.
of funny because he left the group in a huff because
Yeah.
he kept trying to take him to get him to take back David Ruffin, and they wouldn't. So he said, "Fuck you
Yeah.
guys," and that
Yeah.
that was the end of him and the Temptations.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Well, speaking of another R&B artist who didn't have this problem because he was a solo artist, Curtis Mayfield and his album of this year, Roots. The man who is, for modern sensibilities, possibly the single most underrated R&B soul funk legend of all time,
Yeah.
released what may very well be his most underrated album in 1971. Roots picks up where the previous year's album, Curtis, left off with its amalgam of symphonic soul, deep funk, hooky R&B pop, and socio-political commentary that combines the passionate with the intellectual. Opening track Get Down lends further credence to the fact that few artists in history could create better bass lines that drive groove machine songs like Mayfield. The smoky haze of the mid-tempo, state-of-the-world polemic underground is given light by its searing, fuzzed-out guitar that peaks in and out of the mix. The blissful pop of We Got to Have Peace with its glorious horn arrangement bristles with its desperate plea for love and understanding, from the baseline of inner city neighborhoods to the macro level of geopolitics. Now You're Gone, the only romantic relationship song on the album, drives with passionate bluesy intensity. It's a terrific record that would be most R&B artists' best album. For Mayfield, this was just a precursor to the masterpiece that would come out next year. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't even, because the masterpiece came out the next year, Superfly, but
Yeah.
this is closer to Curtis,
Yeah.
and essentially like Get Down and Beautiful Brother of
Yeah.
Mine are kind of
Yeah.
building off what he did with If There's a Hell Below, We're All Gonna Go.
Yeah.
And this album is just, Mayfield just came up with the most rousing, graceful arrangements.
Yeah.
The way that he could get those great fuzzy bass lines with the percussion, with the horns, with the strings, and just have it all just kind of work. And then his voice on this album, I think this is his most beautiful singing.
Mm.
Like Love to Keep You in My Mind.
Right.
We Got to Have Peace.
Right.
Even Underground with some of the speak sing stuff, like Mayfield's speaking voice was just really pretty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The guy had a pretty voice,
Very
and
soft-spoken guy. We spoke like this all the
but
time.
he had that wonderful, just
Yeah.
wonderful voice. But he's just sensational, and there's just everything is just full. It's full. It's rousing and just graceful, and it just he's a masterful arranger, and it just fills the speakers. And this album is just marvelous. And again, definitely a strong precursor. The thing about it is that Curtis is so well known for a lot of its stuff, Move On Up and If There's a Hell Below. And Superfly is such a classic that, like you said, this one kind of gets lost in the shuffle,
Yeah.
but it's almost as good.
Yeah. It really
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. It's pretty extraordinary.
Okay. Next, another kind of sort of underrated album by an all-time great artist.
Yeah, it really is. Now, the third album from San Francisco Bay Area's other great jam band, Santana,
Yeah.
was its second just be titled Santana, hence
Yeah.
why it's known familiarly as Santana 3.
Okay.
They had Santana, then they had Abraxas, and then they had another Santana. So,
Yeah.
so if you look at it on the streaming sites, it shows up as Santana, and in parentheses, I. So yeah, Santana 3. But don't let the lack of creativity in naming albums fool you. This is one of the nastiest, funkiest rock and roll albums imaginable. A sensual party album of the highest order, filled to the brim with one awe-inspiring guitar solo from bandleader Carlos Santana after another. The hit single from this record is one of the most unusual you may ever hear. No One to Depend On is basically two chorus renditions in the midst of a bunch of furious guitar jamming and exciting percussion work. It reaches fever heights and it stays there for 5.5 minutes. Now that's my kind of hit single. I'm also a big fan of Toussaint L'Ouverture, a smoothly rendered 6-minute Latin-inflected stomp with a nicely French name. This album, by the way, is notable for featuring both of the founding members of the band Journey. Yes, yes, that Journey. Neil Schoen supplies rhythm guitar and a little bit of soloing in his first record with the band, while veteran Greg Rowley serves as the band's primary vocalist and keyboardist. Once upon a time, Journey was killer, man. Kuro, what's your thought on Santana?
Yeah, yeah, Santana 3. I think to me this is his best album.
I think so too.
I think it's better than self-titled Santana and Abraxas. What strikes me about this record is the intensity.
Oh
It's
yeah.
really intense. Whereas Abraxas has peaks and valleys. It's a great album too, but it gets mellow and smooth, then it gets rocking, and then it goes up and down. This one just intense all the way through. I wonder if cocaine had something to do with it by this point.
Could be. I think everybody in 1971. That's when everybody started to figure out, oh, cocaine's a hell of a drug. I think that's by 74. I mean, everybody's fried. I mean,
Yeah.
cocaine is like defining everything that you're hearing on the radio, but it starts pretty much in earnest in 1971.
Well,
Definitely has that feel.
yeah. Well, if the next artist had done more cocaine, he probably wouldn't have killed himself in 1974.
Yeah. I was gonna say more cocaine and less antidepressants there, Nick.
Yeah. Nick Drake with his album Brighter Later, spelled with a Y, Bryterlayter. British folk singer-songwriter Nick Drake was virtually unknown and ignored during his time from the late 1960s through to his death in 1974. However, in the 1990s, people within music media and various artists started singing his praises to such an extent that now he's become a legend posthumously. He only released 3 studio albums, and 1971's Brighter Later is his most full-bodied, most expansive work. His intricate guitar playing, enigmatic lyrics, and ghostly melodies are still there, but they're backed by elegant string arrangements and supple support from a full band. Folk rock legend and one of this podcast's all-time favorites, Richard Thompson, lends his patented spindly guitar work to the lush, sprightly pop of Hazy Jane 2. The breezy jazz folk of One of These Things First goes down easy with complex but not alienating interplay between the bass and drums in a time signature that comes close to waltz time. Poor Boy is a lilting samba with a luscious saxophone solo, while Northern Sky, which is possibly Drake's greatest song, soars with a melodic beauty and grace that is truly breathtaking. A thoroughly perfect album from beginning to end. Chris?
Yeah, good stuff. I'll admit I wasn't entirely familiar with this record
Yeah.
until this week. I had heard bits and pieces of it, but compared to Pink Moon, this thing is a party record.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Pink Moon came out in 72 and is pretty much known as Drake's masterpiece, but it's very downtrodden. Whereas
Yeah.
whereas this one is it actually it's got optimistic tones to it. You've got
Yeah.
the Richard Thompson guitar. The title track is really pretty. A really nice instrumental, kind of similar to classical gas uh
Mm. Yeah.
of all pieces of music, but it does kind of have that. So Nick Drake was capable of some positivity in his soul and in his folk music, and it shows up here in Brighter Later. Good stuff.
Yeah. All right. Now, next, an artist that we talked about a few episodes ago, but yeah, he put out his greatest record in 1971. Chris?
Yeah, Rod Stewart's Every Picture Tells a Story. Those of you listening probably remember we did an episode a few months back that we cheekily titled Rod Stewart, What the Fuck Happened? We made the point on that episode that while most of us know and probably revile Mr. Stewart and the cheesy, way too happy, spikily blonde-haired singer of Infatuation, Young Turks, and other odes to the power of selling your soul in order to stay relevant and near the top of the Billboard Hot 100 no matter what, Stewart actually began his career as a first-rate renderer of awesomely inspiring folk rock anthems. Stewart was a spectacularly great interpreter of other people's songs and a very, very good songwriter in his own right, lending his songs with conviction and his powerful, gravelly voice. His finest album from this early period of his career is 1971's Every Picture Tells a Story. You'll know the song Maggie May from it. It's still in heavy rotation in multiple radio formats across the world. But there's also a wonderful cover of Tim Hardin's Reason to Believe, a soulful song made even more soulful by Rod the Bod. But that's not really what'll surprise you the most. Check out Stewart's cover of Bob Dylan's Tomorrow is a Long Time, which is just gorgeous, accompanied as it is with gentle pedal steel guitar and violin. This dude could man a folk classic better than just about anyone who ever lived. This album was and still is a gift to the rock and roll universe and is probably one of the 100 greatest ever released. What say you about this album, Arturo?
Yeah, I don't go top 100, but I do have it pretty high. Listen, Stewart's greatest during this period, his greatest talent, his greatest skills, like really doing soulful covers and imbuing covers with more
Yeah,
soul than they had before. And number two, making acoustic folk-based music rock.
rock.
No one made
Yeah.
acoustic music rock like early Rod Stewart could. And this album, like his other early records, are really a testament to that. Now for the next one, this band needs no qualification. The Allman Brothers Band and their live album At Fillmore East. Contrary to what some people, especially modern music fans, want to believe, the fathers of Southern rock were not stereotypical rednecks who waved the Confederate flag, whinged on about their freedom to have guns, and sang songs about drunken bar fights and hot mamas. That's actually what Lynyrd Skynyrd would eventually become, especially after they reformed in the 1990s. The Allman Brothers Band were sophisticated musicians with eclectic tastes and influences, and their general attitudes were quite progressive for the time. Yes, guitarist Dickie Betts would go on to write Ramblin' Man and Blue Sky, the country music tinged songs that would become some of the band's biggest hits in the next couple of years. But Betts, as well as guitarist and band leader Duane Allman, were both big jazz fans, and the influence of Miles Davis, particularly his classic 1959 album of modal jazz, Kind of Blue, was a big touchstone for the composition In Memory of Elizabeth Reed, a song that exists in blistering live form on this record. Yes, the band's basis was the blues. They indeed played blues rock, but their blues were platforms for extended improvisational jams that incorporated all their stylistic influences: jazz, classical, folk, country, rock, R&B, and soul. This is a historic live album that captures everything that was phenomenal about the original incarnation of the Allman Brothers Band. Is it the best live album ever? I don't go quite that far, but it's way up there. For the record, I recommend not the original live album, which is too short, but the 2-disc deluxe edition from 2003. Chris?
Yeah, the deluxe edition has some really really great stuff, and so a couple of the blues songs that they covered from the debut record show up on the deluxe album, and there's actually a couple of cuts from the concerts that didn't make the original At Fillmore East that show up on Eat a Peach a couple of years later. This album is extraordinary. They were an astonishing live band. I mean, just the whole concept of having these two virtuosic lead guitar players that could do the double lead line thing, along with two drummers, and just the way that they could stomp, and the way that they just had a suppleness, and they just had a confidence to them. And again, there's that jazz influence. There's the Miles Davis influence. There's just even Coltrane in some ways in terms of just
Right.
performative brilliance, and the way that they could just feed off each other. I mean, just you imagine being Dickie Betts and knowing and being one of the world's best guitar players, but being the second best guitar player in your own band.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, like the version of In Memory of Elizabeth Reed on this is pretty telling because it's extraordinarily well done, and it's actually legend has it, it's a stitching of two different performances. Yeah, that they took parts of one night and mixed it with parts of the next night, and so it's not actually a full live rendering. There's a
Right.
little bit of studio trickery there, but you listen to that, and Dickie starts it with this incredible guitar solo, and then they have the double lead line transition into Duane, and then Duane just takes it to like a different planet,
Right.
a different galaxy. I
Yeah.
mean, like a whole different universe, a whole different, he was a parallel universe unto himself. I
Yeah, he
mean,
was.
it goes from Dickie riding the band to the band riding Dwayne Allman.
Right. Yeah.
That's how in the pocket and that's how in stride he is with his playing. It is just otherworldly, just genius, brilliant, just incendiary, awesome, kick-ass shit.
Yeah.
Gotta love it. And
Yeah.
the whole album is like that too. It's pretty awesome. I will say this, if you talk about original live records, not the, pretty much all of the great live records of all time have all gotten a deluxe edition, right?
Right.
But if you talk about the originals, the original at Fillmore East was 7 songs. The original Live at Leeds by The Who was 6 songs. If
Yeah.
you just take the originals, at Fillmore East is better.
Mm.
It's when you stretch them out that Live at Leeds becomes like the greatest thing of all time.
Yeah. Yeah. With the whole show, include the
Yeah,
whole rendition of Tommy that's like in
Tommy.
the middle of the
Yeah,
set.
you take Tommy and you put a quick one in there, and all of a sudden it becomes like just awesome
Right.
and the best. But in their original form, at Fillmore East is better.
Mm.
I'll
Maybe,
maintain that.
quite possibly.
I
All
think
right,
that.
now I'm now we get to the solo Beatles. I've always been and will always be a fierce critic of solo Paul McCartney, but the album he put out in 1971, it's a really good one, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking about Ram, which was McCartney's finest moment as a solo artist. Paul McCartney, of course, is many things in the story of rock and roll. One of his most notable superlatives is as rock's finest crafter of what John Lennon derisively called his granny songs. These are happy, poppy, music hall inspired sing along, clap along tunes that tell silly stories and give off a vibe even your grandmother could love. Hence, that's really where Lennon got the term. The most notable of these granny songs from the Beatles catalog is probably Obla Di Obla Da. The worst of them is unquestionably Maxwell's Silver Hammer, which
Yep.
was at least charming enough to work surprisingly pretty well on 1969's Abbey Road. I
It's
bring up
a song so bad that all three other Beatles, plus even George Martin, hated.
Yeah, McCartney was the only one that liked that song.
Yeah.
Now, I bring up the granny song part of the McCartney story because Ram, McCartney's second album as a solo artist, which was released in 71, contains my absolute favorite of McCartney's granny songs. I mean, come on. Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey is just wonderful. It
I
start
hate that song. It's the only song on the album I don't like.
I love it. I love it. It starts out lovely, pretty, and purely family focused, and then it ends as a full-blown sea shanty. Hands across the water. A bona fide sing-along you could play at your next get-together with your great uncle and great aunt and be successful in doing so.
It sounds like the
McCartney,
worst. It sounds like the worst song by the Decemberists that I never wanted to hear.
oh come on, man! I love that song. It's just a fun song. McCartney was corny, but boy was he damn good at it. The rest of Ram is pretty great too. It's a far superior effort than the awful half-baked self-titled debut album from the year before. That's for sure. McCartney recorded this album Ram, in New York, and unlike the first album, didn't play everything himself, recruiting Ace accompaniment to actualize his first and only fully realized vision as a post-Beatle. Highlights include rumbling reggae-influenced album opener Too Many People, which features some lyrical disses of John Lennon. And then there's the folksy ukulele-driven sort of title track Ram On. And then there's the mid-tempo bopping lovey-dovey song Long-Haired Lady. McCartney wouldn't be this good ever again as a solo artist. His album with Wings, Band on the Run, comes close, but this is the one McCartney affair that rises to the level of truly great. Arturo, other thoughts about Ram?
Yeah, no, I like it a lot. I mean, I still hate Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey. To me, the best track on the album is the last one, "The Backseat of My Car." That's a Beatle-worthy song. There's some other good ones. I like "Heart of the Country" as far as like good old
Yeah,
country songs.
yeah.
"Three Legs" is good. Even "Dear Boy" kind of works. It is. I don't think it's his best solo album. I still think "Band on the Run" is, but I put this right behind "Band on the Run." Now, for the other solo Beatle who put out an album in 1971, John Lennon with Imagine. On Paul McCartney's album Ram, released earlier in 71, there's a song on there, like you mentioned, Chris, called Too Many People, where McCartney takes a not so veiled pot shot at John Lennon and Yoko Ono's at the time political activism and attention-grabbing media stunts. It didn't take Lennon long to respond in kind with the track How Do You Sleep off his 1971 album Imagine. Check some of these lyrics out. I'm going to quote from the song. Okay, here we go. So Sergeant Pepper took you by surprise. You'd better see right through that mother's eyes. Those freaks were right when they said you were dead. The one mistake you made was in your head. You live with straights who tell you was king. Jump when your mama tell you anything. The only thing you done was yesterday. And since you've gone, you're just another day. A pretty face may last a year or two, but pretty soon they'll see what you can do. The sound you make is music to my ears. You must have learned something in all those years. Ouch.
Yikes.
Yeah. Basically, this is what you call an early rock and roll version of what we now know as a hip hop diss track.
Yeah.
The song itself is fantastic, as Lennon sums up a luscious, soulful R&B groove augmented by Phil Spector's stinging, punctuating string arrangement. What's so amazing about this album is that it runs the gamut of the scope of Lennon's artistry. You have tender, painfully introspective ballads with Oh My Love and Jealous Sky. You have fierce, socio-political polemic dressed in swampy, groovy blues rock with I Don't Want to Be a Soldier Mama and Give Me Some Truth. And of course, there's the title track, one of the single most enduringly timeless classic songs in the history of pop music, by far and away the greatest and most memorable of all solo Beatles songs, a song so great that even Paul McCartney plays it live. The song is the ultimate testament to how Lennon had a genius for taking song material that would be trite, sentimental, and corny in any other songwriter's hands and transforming it into something that resonates with earnest and sincere universality for everyone. After the painful introspection, emotional catharsis, and art rock innovation of the previous year's Plastic Ono Band, Lennon needed to come back with a more commercially appealing record, and he did so in spades with Imagine, an album that received both wide critical acclaim and was a rousing commercial success. It's Lennon's second consecutive and probably final solo masterpiece, and the second greatest solo Beatle album after his own record from the previous year. Chris?
Yeah, you used a word that kind of describes this album perfectly. Sincere.
Yeah.
It's a sincere, heartfelt record that it just has an honesty to it, but also a beauty because of that. Because it's in terms of its love songs, in terms of its putting its heart in the right place. Like I said, Imagine, like you said, would be hippy, dopey, trippy in anybody else's hands, but in his hands, it's unbelievable and one of the best songs ever. And then he begins a long-standing tradition through the 70s that anytime he names a song after his wife, it's great.
Yeah.
Yoko is a great song, and
used to great effect by Wes Anderson in the movie Rushmore.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a really tremendous album closer, and it just ends it on as high a note and as sweet a note as possible. I'm a fan of this record. I would still put All Things Must Pass as the number 2 Beatles solo record behind Plastic Ono Band. But this is certainly way up there, probably number 3 for me.
All right, now, Chris, I got a few questions for you.
Yeah, what questions are those?
Who's the black private dick that's a sex machine to all the chicks?
Shaft.
You're damn right. Who is the man that would risk his neck for his brother man?
Shaft.
Can you dig it? Who's the cat that won't cop out when there's danger all about?
Shaft.
Right on. They say this cat Shaft is a bad mother.
Oh, watch your mouth.
Shut your mouth. Shut your mouth. Shut your mouth. But I'm talking about Shaft, and that's what we're talking about. The soundtrack to the pioneering blaxploitation film Shaft, Isaac Hayes with Shaft. Chris, tell us about Shaft.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about this. So blaxploitation was a Hollywood effort to bring urban tales, edgy enough for a black audience, but acceptable enough for a white audience to the big screen. These were films that were often comically melodramatic or just plain old cheeky, done with a wink wink swagger that more than occasionally got one over on the man. They're a fun retrospective watch these days, but here's something that's not exactly a secret. These were not great movies. They were entertainments that generally didn't strive for cinematic flair on a par with Fellini.
Shaft was good though.
Yeah, Shaft is entertaining. I mean, like I said, at their best, they're entertaining. But let's just put it this way: the best of these blaxploitation movies is probably Sweet Sweetback's badass song.
Yeah.
But even then, I mean, Lethal Weapon 3 is probably still a better movie. Uh, so, so why exactly are we talking about blaxploitation films? Because undoubtedly their greatest legacy was in their soundtracks and scores.
Yeah.
Virtually all of the great black singer-songwriters of the age penned the music for at least one of these movies. James Brown, for instance, contributed to Black Caesar with Down and Out in New York City, which is just an awesome song. Curtis Mayfield got subversive and scored Superfly from 1972 to be a super serious exploration of the seductive qualities of crime, and it ran counter to the actual film, which glorifies its pimp dope dealer hero. Superfly is probably the best soundtrack album ever produced as a result. And then there was Bobby Womack, who did Across 110th Street. You want to talk about, when I mentioned comically melodramatic, the first movie that came to mind was Across 110th Street, with Anthony Quinn as the white cop, with the white cop. All these movies had to have the token white cop, and he was the white cop in that movie. So anyway, so those are examples. But here we have Isaac Hayes in 1971 getting into the blaxploitation act as well, and doing it better than anybody except Mayfield. Stax's resonant songwriting and musical genius had released Hot Buttered Soul in 1969 to become a shining star in his own right. He wasn't just the backing guy anymore. How to follow up? With this wonderful soundtrack to the ridiculously entertaining film Shaft. Where are you going, Shaft? I'm going to get laid. This music just captures the fun energy and peppy, ironic feel of the film, supplying a series of lushly rendered, uniquely instrumented songs that are as steeped in classical music at times as they are in soul. Check out the song Ellie's Love Theme and its xylophone magic for proof. While most of the songs are short, befitting their use as scene-grabbing backing to filmic interludes, the highlight of Shaft, the album, is the 19-minute-long piece Do Your Thing, which is the epitome of sexual chocolate music. What an enjoyable romantic suite that is. You got to remember, this is the guy that was chosen to play Chef on South Park, and he was chosen for a reason, you know?
Yeah.
Great stuff here, Arturo, right?
Great stuff. I know. Yeah. I mean, like I said, we're going to do a blaxploitation soundtrack episode soon, where we're going to talk about all the best songs from that, but we're not going to talk about Shaft, because Shaft and Superfly are the two exceptions. They exist on their own little realm. As for Shaft itself, yeah, dude, this is even the instrumental segues.
Yep.
Are great music and on their own. I mean, it's more than just background music to listen to. It's really great music, you know. Yeah. Isaac Hayes, he was a great composer. He wasn't just a soulful, love man singer.
No, like, he was a bona fide genius. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a bona fide musician genius, and this is one of his two best records, along with Hot Buttered Soul. His two masterpieces. All right, now we're going to end our 1971 lightning round with the final album by a band that we also talked about several episodes ago. We discussed The Doors' L.A. Woman in quite a bit of detail in a previous episode of ours called In Defense of the Doors. Please go back to your curmudgeonly library in whatever podcast platform you use and check it out if you have it. Basically, the band knew they were at the end of the road when they went into the studio to record L.A. Woman. Hell, singer Jim Morrison would die just a few months later after recording was finished. What the band started on the previous year's album, Morrison Hotel, with diving into their bluesy roots, they took to its logical conclusion on this album. That is a lean, mean, straightforward, bluesy as hell, bluesy blues rock album full of menace and swagger. Songs like The Changeling, Bend Down So Long, Car Hiss By My Window, and Crawling King Snake follow the template brilliantly. But it's on other tracks where this album's riches really show. Love Her Madly is the terrific, catchy pop single that brought the band back to the top 20 of the Billboard pop chart, but it's the epic, hypnotic groove of the title track, with its sudden breakdown in the middle and slow surge to catharsis that truly mesmerizes. And then there's the smoky, meditative, jazzy Riders on the Storm, one of the lyrically more disturbing songs in the band's repertoire. And that's saying something.
Yeah, seriously.
The Doors started their career with the masterpiece that is their self-titled album, and they ended their career, with Morrison at least, with a near masterpiece and probably their most rocked out album. Chris?
Yeah, what an evolution. I mean, to start from that sort of Kurt Weill on acid kind of stuff that they were doing on the first album, to go from that to this sort of rocked out bar blues that they did here, and just heavy as shit, and just so, but also just kind of groovy as shit too. Like the song "L.A. Woman" is just like that. That's just an epic romp. And just the evolution of the band to go from that and to kind of deconstruct themselves and rebuild themselves as this kind of band is just really stunning. And also, I would say that L.A. Woman is the finest testament to the talent of Ray Manzarek, in the sense that, you know, obviously when we all think of the Doors, the first two things we think of Jim Morrison prancing around in leather pants with no shirt on. But then we think of all those organ parts from like Light My Fire and Alabama Song and Break On Through and all of that. Well, by the end of this the stretch, they're not doing that sort of psychedelic chamber music anymore. They're doing straight blues, but Manzarek was able to roll with the punches and do it beautifully. He switches to tack piano and electric keyboards. You know, L.A. Woman, Riders on the Storm has that, you know, engaging electric piano. And so Manzarek was a huge talent and really underrated.
He was the band leader, actually, believe it or not. Morrison was the front man, but Manzarek was the leader of the band.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, he's the one that kept them all together when Morrison kind of fell apart and became a drunken mess. Manzarek was the businessman. And he actually kept them going for 2 albums after this one, after Morrison died, with 2 utterly forgettable pieces of crap. But anyway, God bless Ray Manzarek for being so talented and be able to roll with the punches and evolve with the band in step. Really fabulous stuff, and a great album. In a year spiked with them, as we have duly established. So here we've ended our lightning round. We've already kind of addressed the whole "is 71 the greatest year ever" thing, but let's talk about 71. What would you say, Arturo, is the single or the singular legacy of 1971? If you had to put a tag on it, what would you say about 71 is the ultimate thing?
It's where the 1960s finally ended. You know, because one of the themes we're going to explore in the 1972 episode of this second Golden Age of Rock series, 72 is when the 70s really started. You know, all those debut albums by Steely Dan and the Eagles. You know, Stevie Wonder started coming out on his own. He was always on his own, but this is when he really grew up and matured into the master that he became. You started hearing the beginnings of reggae crossing over to the mainstream. So 1971 for me is like when the 60s really ended.
Yeah. You know? Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think that, and which makes sense in the sense that, you know, Led Zeppelin reaches their zenith, the Who reaches their zenith. So all these bands that, you know, cut their teeth and became big in the late 60s, because, you know, getting to the height of their powers in 71 makes sense. And then, so where do they go from there? Well, we'll talk about that in the next episode of this series coming up in a couple of months, called 1972. What a year. And
that will be the final episode of our second Golden Age of Rock series.
Yes, because 1973 does not belong to a golden age, but 1972 does, and it is the end of the second Golden Age of Rock. And with that, as we like to do at the ends of these episodes, we encourage you to join our Curmudgeonly community on Facebook. A good time will be had by all up there, including you. We've been really active up there lately, sharing music pieces that we love, both new and old. I actually went up there and shared some Pink Floyd and Al Green over the last week or so, and planning to post some Savoy Brown. Gosh, I love Savoy Brown. And so doing that soon. So join us there in the community at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Have any beefs or any thoughts about what we had to say on this episode, hit us up at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com with a nice, lovely fan letter. We would love to get them. And as we've been doing for the last several months, we have put together a Spotify playlist, the link to which will be in our show notes and in the episode description, wherever you're picking up this your podcast episode, whether you're on Apple or Stitcher or Amazon or anywhere else. You'll be able to click on that link and listen to all this great music from 1971. It'll be probably about 7 hours worth of music, but it'll definitely be worth your investment. Check it out. And